Okay, so welcome again to Zoom into Archaeology. My name is Nicole Granan. I'm the public archaeologist for the Florida Public Archaeology Network, and we're excited again this week to be back with Zoom into Archaeology on our Thursday afternoon. And today I'm especially excited to introduce our speaker, Dr. Allysha Winburn. In September, we've decided to feature the research of faculty at the University of West Florida, and she is our first speaker for this month. Thank you so much for volunteering to speak with us today. And without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you, Allysha.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much, Nicole. So I am going to share my screen so you all can see what I'm seeing as I walk you through sort of a day in the life of being an anthropologist associated with the POW and MIA mission. Let's see. Okay. All right. Now, on my screen, Nicole, I can see a little gallery of people's names that are kind of blocking the screen. If you can see that too, could you just let me know so that I can kind of resolve that?
It looks good on my screen. I think it's probably just the way people have their desktop set up, so it looks good here.
Great. Well, anyway, thank you so much to Nicole and to FPAN. And I'm particularly pleased to be included in the Zoom into Archaeology, even though I know that my subspecialty of anthropology, forensic anthropology, is not archaeology, strictly speaking. So for those of you who may be unaware, forensic anthropology is the application of biological anthropology knowledge to questions of medical legal significance. So basically, forensic anthropologists are experts in human variation, and then they parlay that expertise into typically identifying an unknown decedent and helping to figure out how they died. So no, not archaeology, strictly speaking, but I would argue that to do good forensic field recoveries, you have to practice archaeology. You're just basically treating a crime scene like a site. And many forensic anthropologists, myself included, are archaeologically trained. And in particular, in the unique application of forensic anthropology that I'm going to highlight today, you'll see that archaeological method and theory is absolutely essential. So the topic of today's talk is the POW and MIA recovery mission and how forensic anthropology intersects with that mission. And although I am currently an assistant professor at UWF, my backstory includes working for the POW and MIA mission. So I'm no longer affiliated with the DPAA, which is the agency in charge of this mission, but it has a near and dear place in my heart. It is an incredible mission, and I think that by the end of today's talk, you'll see why. So forensic anthropology actually has almost 100 years of history of collaboration with the US military in terms of identifying the remains of unknown decedents. Now, I will specify that the POW and MIA mission that we're talking about today is not the involvement of anthropologists in the identification of people who fall in modern conflicts. So there are anthropologists involved with that mission, but fewer of them. Because in large part of the role that DNA plays in modern military identifications. So when we're talking about the POW and MIA mission, we're talking about historic conflicts, specifically World War II, the Korean War, and the Vietnam conflict. And we're still missing around 80,000 service members from those three conflicts alone, including around 70,000 from World War II, around 8,000 from Korea, and less than 2,000 from Vietnam. And so you can see here on the top an AGRS technician, American Graves Registration Services technician doing a dental coding analysis of some skeletal remains during the World War II era. And then on the bottom, you can see Dr. Mildred Trotter, who's kind of one of the mothers of the field of forensic anthropology, who was a forensic anthropologist associated with the US military right after World War II. And so we've been sort of involved in the recovery and identification mission ever since. And so at Trotter's time, in and around 1947, the US military realized that a centralized approach to identification made sense. In essence, Dr. Trotter, her anthropologists, her technicians, odontologists or dentists, embalmers, undertakers, they were all housed under one roof in what was called a CIL, or a central identification laboratory, that was tasked with the identification of the bodies of service members that couldn't be identified through normal means. So forensic anthropologists typically deal with decomposed or skeletonized remains. And up until this time, identifications for decomposed and skeletonized service members were hard to come by. So this was a real breakthrough in terms of collaboration with anthropologists and the military. And that central identification lab worked, and that format continued throughout Korea and throughout the Vietnam conflict, and it continues to this day. So the modern CIL is located in Honolulu, Hawaii, and it's associated with an agency called the Defense POW and MIA Accounting Agency, or the DPAA. So that's the agency that I had the privilege of working for around 5 years. So today's CIL houses forensic anthropologists, archaeologists, forensic dentists, both civilian and military, DNA techs, historians, quality control people, intelligence officers, and personnel from all branches of the US military. So it is really a collaborative and sort of a joint recovery mission, both in terms of military and civilian personnel. And also when we go on these recovery missions to places where the US has historically come into conflict with other countries, we are then collaborating with foreign nationals from those countries in order to get those recoveries done. So a really sort of unique model, a uniquely collaborative model. So basically what the CIL scientists are tasked with doing is responding to locations that have been identified as possible lost locations, incident locations, potentially aircraft crashes, battlefield burials, anywhere that the historians are able to correlate a particular loss with a particular individual. That's where the CIL will mobilize a team to go. And so the anthropologists, of course, you know, we're lab rats. We're really good at skeletal analyses, but that's only part of our job if we are associated with this agency. So forensic anthropologists kind of split their time between the lab and the field. And because this is a Zoom into archaeology talk, I decided to focus on the fieldwork aspect of that job. So for the forensic anthropologists, and particularly for the forensic archaeologists associated with the DPAA, only part of their time is spent in Honolulu, Hawaii, and the rest of it is spent deploying to Germany, Italy, Papua New Guinea, Vietnam, Laos, and acting as the scientific control on military recovery teams that can include people from material evidence specialists to exploded ordnance disposal technicians to combat camera, the photographers. And so all of them working together with the anthropologist or the archaeologist kind of as the point person who's calling the shots and making sure that the recovery progresses to a high scientific standard. So essentially we're enforcing archaeological controls in the field, even though our team isn't made up necessarily of archaeologists, but rather of military personnel and foreign nationals. So you're looking here at a typical DPAA commuter vehicle, because by nature of the fact that most easy to access lost locations were already processed in the immediately post-war years, the sites that are available for DPAA teams to respond to tend to be remote. So we're talking helicopter access, or even more remote. Maybe you're just accessing it by a pretty treacherous hike up a mountainside. Maybe you're base camping in little tarp and wooden hooches. Maybe you're staying at a guest house. Maybe you have more lush accommodations, you know, depending on the region of the world that you're deploying to. But either way, you are sort of kind of the last line of defense in terms of finding these people, bringing them home and getting them ID'd, because search and recovery teams would have gotten to them earlier if they could have. So we're taking an archaeological approach because the sites that we are deploying to are historic. You know, they're dating to the 70s, the 50s, the 40s. So a lot of time has passed, which is why we need to process them to a high scientific standard. This is the image of a person who loves her job. This is a much younger me deploying to a site in Laos. And the reason I'm smiling is because this is where I'm reporting to work. So a beautiful riverside site, which represented a last known alive location of 2 US service members. Now, one difference between traditional archaeology and the kind of archaeology that is done by DPAA teams is the scale. So often, and particularly when the scientists are dealing with aircraft crashes, you're looking at a site that is potentially spread over multiple football fields, scattered down mountain faces, in ravines, underwater. So because of the scale of the site, kind of the scale of the archaeology gets ramped up too. And that's where that collaborative aspect comes into play. So as soon as the teams hit the ground, they establish a base camp. Now in some of those more remote locations, the base camp is actually where they're sleeping and eating and living too. But in this case, we would helicopter into the site each day. And our base camp was just like, if you've ever did an FPAN tour of one of the field school sites that we have here at UWF, and you've been to the field house, this is our field house. So you can see our break room table there, all of our shovels and our screens, all of our gear, all my mapping equipment, my transit, my trowel. So everything gets stored here, and this is where the archaeology happens, because it's up to that anthropologist to figure out the nature of the site. Are you looking for a single battlefield grave, or are you looking for the remains of an aircraft that has been dispersed over the landscape, and kind of determining the archaeological response appropriate to that scale. But regardless, the same types of things that you'd see in a normal archaeological site are done. A grid is in place, provenience units are strung up, unit by unit is excavated systematically in systematic levels, and of course, every cubic centimeter of dirt that comes out of that site, no matter how large the scale, gets processed through a screen. So for those of you who've never been on an archaeological site, particularly one involving small items like human remains, fragmentary human remains, human teeth, items of evidence, so you need to make sure that all of the non-evidentiary dirt goes through the screens, leaving only the potentially evidentiary material on top. And so yes, even for a site that covers an entire football field, every provenience unit of dirt gets screened. Now, if that is a smaller scale site, like you see here, I was just digging test pits, and here's my team members doing just a typical shaker screen. Sometimes that approach works. Other times, you have to enlist the local populace to help to staff these massive screening operations. And so what you're looking at here is a team of Lao workers and a team of US workers working together with the assistance of water pressure to move clayey, water-infiltrated sediments through this 1/4 inch mesh so that things like bones, pieces of somebody's uniform, pieces of life support equipment, teeth, anything like that will be retained atop the screen, and anything non-evidentiary falls through. So again, the assistance and the cooperation of the local folks is absolutely essential. Usually the DPAA teams only include maybe 10 individuals. So you have, say, 9 military personnel and your 1 scientific control. And then everything else is assisted by local people. And so usually there is always a US individual on each screen, being that the final eyes on the screen before it gets dumped to make sure that there's nothing evidentiary there. But in terms of moving the dirt, in terms of assisting with wet screening, a lot of that is done by local people. And so in this case, you can see some Lao workers lined up helping us to move dirt in a bucket brigade, essentially, from the excavation unit to the wet screens. And sometimes smaller friends help out. And sometimes those small friends bring even smaller friends. So a dog on site, always good for morale. Anyway, at the center of all of this is the anthropologist or the archaeologist. And again, they are kind of the sole scientific control, kind of the linchpin in the middle of the mayhem. They have to be everywhere at once. So any type of note-taking is done by the anthropologist. Any type of map making is done by the anthropologist. Deciding where to excavate next, done by the anthropologist. Keeping control of the provenience of the sediments that are going to the screens, Again, anthropologists. Sometimes these sites are so large that you have two simultaneous excavations going at the same time, with dirt from one provenience going to one screen, dirt from another provenience going to another screen. The anthropologist is in charge of coordinating all of that, searching through all the buckets at the end of each shift to make sure that nothing evidentiary is missed, and just generally being the scientific control who could answer all the questions of the personnel. And remember, people who augment a DPAA team may never have had an archaeology course in their life. You know, they basically come to Hawaii and they get a crash course in this is what a bone looks like, and then off they go. And so it's really important, again, kind of that collaborative aspect, that the anthropologist can communicate with them and can be an effective liaison between the US and local personnel, between all of the different branches of service, just kind of doing what anthropologists do best, which is talking to people. And so fortunately, we have lots of help. So you can see here, I have a walkie-talkie, so I can be a million places at once. In this picture, I'm talking to one of the most important persons on the site, the explosive ordnance disposal technician, and he's looking at a little piece of metal to make sure that it's not bomb frag, and if it is, the bomb has already been detonated. So especially when you're working in a place like Laos, which was heavily bombed during the Vietnam conflict, the possibility of encountering live ordnance is very real. And so each person on that recovery team has their own role to play. So in this case, the EOD technician is keeping us safe. I'm keeping the scientific control. The photographer was taking this picture. The life support specialist, who's an individual who is an expert at looking at any tiny little fragment of evidence and saying if it came from any aspect of life support, be it a flight suit or an oxygen hose that might have been associated with the individual decedent that we're looking for. So at the end of the day, or at the end of the mission, missions can take between a month to 2 months, usually around 6 weeks. At the end of the day, everybody packs up and they go home to their base camp, whatever that may look like. And so you can see here, this is a beautiful resort in Ponsavon in Laos. So this was a very, very, very nice base camp. The supply tents in front might be more what a rural or mountainside base camp would look like. So again, the remoteness of your site sort of dictates the type of base camp that you are encamped in. So at the end of a 6-week or month-long or 2-month-long recovery mission, it's up to the anthropologist to decide, do we have sufficient evidence to close out this site? Or is there evidence that there may be more material here? Does it warrant further investigation? If it's a large aircraft crash, maybe only a third or a fourth of that site could have gotten processed during a single 6-week recovery mission, in which case another recovery mission will deploy back to that same site in 6 months or a year. And so you have these extraordinary interactions, cultural interactions, scientific interactions, that the anthropologist plays a major role in addition to being the final scientific say on whether a site is closed or whether a site remains open. Add to this sort of the physical stress of operating potentially on a mountainside, dealing with an underwater site. So as the DPAA has expanded over the past several decades, they now employ dedicated underwater archaeologists, which could be of interest to some of you maritime archaeologists at UWF. That's one of our specialties here. They employ specific mountaineer trained personnel to assist on those really rigorous recovery sites that are mountainside or cliff face side. There have even been recoveries recently on glaciers in Alaska, or through deep, deep ice caps in Greenland. So for each challenge, no two sites are the same. There's no one-size-fits-all DPAA recovery approach. And so the anthropologist who's in charge of a site has to be really flexible and sort of really creative and think on their feet in order to ensure that everything gets processed to a high scientific standard. If the recovery is successful and remains are found, then they become, they go into the custody of the anthropologist. So they are treated as evidence. They are bagged and tagged and evidence taped. And the anthropologist is responsible them throughout their long journey home to the United States. And it's at that time that the lab analyses take over. So those remains would be assigned to a different scientist, somebody who did not do the recovery, to try to retain that separation, that sort of idea of blind analysis as much as possible. So the person who's doing the lab analysis doesn't know the details of the loss because they weren't the person who processed the site in the field. But they would be looking at what's called the biological profile, so sort of a skeletal snapshot of what that person might have looked like during their life, to try to narrow down the list of possible matching casualties. And then the forensic dentists would be coding the teeth. They would be taking dental radiographs. The mitochondrial DNA techs would be sampling for DNA to match with families of the decedent. So all of those lines of evidence come together, and if they are successful, and if the medical examiner who's in charge of making the identification says, yep, that is a match beyond reasonable doubt, that is indeed the remains of casualty X, then that information is presented to the family. And unique in the forensic world, the family gets the final say of whether the identification is accepted or rejected. In most cases, the family accept the identification, but say the remains that are brought back are few or fragmentary, well, then that family would be within their rights to say, I think my loved one could still be alive out there. Go back, do a different recovery. I need more proof. And again, that happens quite rarely, but it does happen. And I think that's really special too, that it kind of puts into perspective who this mission is serving, and it's the families. So ultimately, the family gets to decide if they accept that ID. Does the loved one come home to be buried in a private cemetery in the community, or do they go potentially to Arlington, like you see in this image here? And so many DPAA anthropologists kind of feel like they are acting on behalf of the family. You ask them, why do you do this? And many will say, for the service members, or maybe for myself, I'd like to know that I wouldn't be left behind, no one left behind. And others would say, I do it for the families. Because living with the ambiguous loss of knowing that your loved one is not coming home, but also simultaneously not knowing the circumstances of their loss, not having something concrete, not having a body, not having a death certificate, can really wreak a psychological toll on a family member. And so at the end of the day, I think the most important service that the DPAA anthropologist provides is ending that ambiguous loss, kind of closing the book on that particular chapter of that family's story, so that the family can grieve and move on in whatever way they see fit. So these images were actually taken at the Arlington funeral of an individual that was a case that I had worked on. So in summary, this is forensic anthropology. We're still using the same skill set that a medical legal forensic anthropologist would use, but we are applying it to this particular scenario of resolving historic losses, of resolving casualty losses from historic US conflicts. And at the end of the day, I personally come from a family where a lot of people have served, and that isn't something that I felt was in my skill set, but this was. So I have the skill set to do forensic archaeological recoveries and forensic anthropological analyses. And so I've always viewed this as my way to serve. And I've been incredibly lucky to have the opportunity to do that. So I'm showing my email here. If any of you don't get your question answered in the question period that's going to follow, feel free to send me an email anytime. I also want to give a little shout out to the photographers that contributed to this PowerPoint.
Thank you.
And that's it for me.
That was a wonderful presentation.
I'm so glad you enjoyed it.
Yeah, I saw that we did have a couple of questions for you in the
Great.
chat box there.
Okay, let's see what we got. The forensics efforts created by the military, were they adopted by law enforcement, or did that effort evolve independently? This is such a great question. I will say that I don't think that forensic anthropology would take the form that it does today if it weren't for this historic relationship with the military. Because the DPAA employs and has consistently employed more forensic anthropologists than any other agency in the country. And this is a mission that people care about, which means that it's well funded. It's not going anywhere. People, people are interested in their research. They're interested in advancing the methods that are done at the DPAA, and then that feeds back to the benefit of the rest of the field. So I've always sort of thought of the DPAA SIL as like the flagship institution of forensic anthropology. Not that it's not where forensic anthropology started. It certainly has, forensic anthropology has deep roots in that mission. So I guess the answer is sort of yes to both. So they evolved independently. Forensic anthropology kind of began answering questions in the law enforcement and medical examiner sphere, but it was very quickly applied to these recoveries and analyses of the missing from US conflicts. And so kind of the interaction between those two different spheres has been really powerful in terms of upping the scientific standards that are done in the field of forensic anthropology. And to this day, the DPAA SIL is one of the few forensic anthropology laboratories that's actually accredited like a crime lab. So, you know, when people talk about blind analysis, when people talk about peer review, when they talk about auditing their cases, a lot of that language is coming from that accreditation, coming from that crime scene standard. And the DPAA has always been at the forefront of pushing our field toward those standards. So yeah, we owe a lot to them. Kylie says, how does one eventually get involved in the DPAA? Okay, so there's a couple of different pathways for involvement. So sort of the first line of involvement would be as a government service or GS forensic anthropologist. In order to be a GS anthropologist with a mission, I could be mistaken, but I'm pretty sure you need to have a doctoral degree. Or maybe your ABD, you're on your way to getting your doctorate, but you don't, maybe you haven't defended yet. So you have to be either advanced in your doctoral study, or you have to have a degree in hand. But if you just have an MA, and even if you have a terminal MA and you have no desire to go on to get a PhD, you can get involved now through a different pathway, which kind of follows the CRM model. So there are field schools at some colleges that actually do DPAA recoveries. There are CRM companies that staff DPAA recoveries. And in particular, if you Google SNA International, like the initials SNA International, that's a company that hires a lot of contractors to work on DPAA missions. And so what I've told you about in this talk is just the tip of the iceberg. So the recoveries are only half or even a third or a quarter of the story, because there are some DPAA folks that just work in the lab. And a lot of those MA level SNA contractors are working on what are called special projects. So you may, for example, apply to SNA with a master's or a PhD and get appointed to a special project like the application of stable isotopes to determining whether someone likely grew up in Southeast Asia or the United States. Because sometimes if remains are few and fragmentary and all we have is a single tooth or a single bone, we have to rely on the chemical composition of that tooth or bone to indicate potentially the diet or the region of origin of that individual during their life. And so there's a whole stable isotopes team that is developing at the DPAA. There's your underwater archaeology people, there's your mountaineers, and there's commingling specialists. And I did see the name of a former colleague on a commingling project called the K208 on here. It's awesome to see you. So commingled remains, as the name sort of implies, are remains that are mixed or mingled together. So the intermixed remains of more than one decedent. And there are many situations that service members have gotten into that have led to the commingling of remains, from being buried in POW camp graves and then excavated and commingled sort of in the process of repatriation, not by the DPAA. This is sort of predating those analyses, or the loss of a battleship, which it capsizes, it's hard to right it takes months. remains decompose, they commingle. By the time the remains are recovered, it's a massively commingled assemblage of remains. So you'd be surprised how many commingling scenarios the U.S. military is confronted with in their identification efforts, to the point where there are whole laboratories that are dedicated to these commingling efforts. And one of them is in Omaha, Nebraska. So there's a laboratory there staffed by commingling specialists, combination of GS employees and SNA contractors, who go into work every day and try to figure out which piece and which part goes with which individual, using a combination of mitochondrial DNA and taphonomy and isotopes and articulation analyses and measurements. And so, I mean, it was very challenging to limit this talk to just 30 minutes, because there's so much that this mission entails. But certainly that SNA route is, I think, a really, really valuable one. Rachel says, is there a way to get involved in the DPAA when your main focus isn't anthropology? For example, I'm in radio television production and have minors in criminal justice. Is there room at the DPAA? I don't know. I mean, I will say that the traditional specialties are anthropology, archaeology, dentistry, DNA, historians, history. But I know that people with criminal justice degrees have worked there in terms of, like, as an evidence coordinator or kind of a case file coordinator or an evidence processor. I do think, Rachel, that your pathway to DPAA employment would have to be a little bit non-traditional. And to that end, I would recommend maybe looking into doing an internship there and seeing if you think that you do fit, if you think that you could bring your criminal justice or your television production background to any of the projects that they're working on. So well, who knows in this pandemic reality, but they did have a thriving internship program, which is on a volunteer basis. But if you are enrolled in an academic institution, you can get academic credit for it. So I've seen great success in terms of young up and coming forensic anthropologists first interning there, and then that leading to employment for them. Now, the limiting factor there is the price. I mean, you're working for free. You have to fly to Hawaii and you have to live in Hawaii for a semester. So that is challenging. But also, you have to live in Hawaii for a semester. Not the worst thing in the world. Eliza says, how often are anthropologists sent to a site? Are there any active right now? Great questions. In my day, back in my day, 5-10 years ago, the forensic anthropologist would be deployed between 2 and 3 times a year. So you'd be spending a lot of your time in the field. From what I have heard, now they're only deploying forensic anthropologists once a year. So the archaeologists, I think, likely have a little bit more of a hectic schedule. But now that they are following sort of that contractor model, the pressure is off of the in-house staff to do every single recovery. So they can, farm out the recoveries to other qualified personnel, which means that anthropologists are doing it less. And that's, that can be a good thing or a bad thing, depending on your perspective. There are no active deployments right now. So Hawaii is, or was just recently on lockdown. They were doing sort of a rotating shift thing where the lab anthropologists were able to go in and work about 4 hours a day, and then they would sort of rotate in and rotate out. And I think that is now off the books with their recent lockdown. They've had a recent surge of cases. But regardless, the international travel that so defines the mission has not been happening recently for obvious reasons. Stephanie says it is worth it, the internship. Yes, Stephanie is one of my success stories. Her bosses at the DPAA loved her and she did me proud. Any other questions?
Yeah, if anyone has any questions, feel free to go ahead and type them now. Maybe while you're typing, I'll just go ahead and plug next week's Zoom into Archaeology program. We're featuring another UWF colleague, and Dr. Catherine Miller-Wolf will be presenting for us next week, and she's going to be talking about some of her experience with excavating ancient burials in Central America at some of the sites she's worked in. So if you're interested in joining us for that next week, you can go to our Facebook page and just look for Florida Public Archaeology Network Northwest Region. You'll find it under our events, and then you can click on the registration link there. You can also go to our website, which I'll go ahead and type in the chat box for those of you who don't know, but that's fpan.us. And then I also put all of our Zoom into Archaeology programs on there as well, and you can follow those to register for the talks. So, ooh, looks like we do have another question there.
Great. Kylie, does the DPAA work with ROTC cadets for internships? I would definitely look into that, because obviously, given their close relationship with the military, they do preference veterans in hiring, you know, as any government service position does. So I think that that could certainly be an in.
Excellent.
Okay, thank you all so much. I love talking about this. It was just such a pleasure and a privilege to get to work on this mission, and I love to share that with people.
Yeah, well, it's fantastic work, and it's clear you really enjoyed what you do. So how could you not, right?
It was really special.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Allysha, for joining us today. And thanks to everybody also for coming this week. I know we're kind of branching out of our little archaeology sphere this month with some bigger and related research, which I think it's kind of good for all of us to get out of our little bubbles sometimes. So thank you so much again for doing
Absolutely.
that for us.
Anytime.
And we'll look forward to seeing, hopefully, some of you next week joining us or at future presentations. If you want to watch this again, I'm going to throw it up on YouTube probably by Monday. So you can watch it again there, too, if you're interested. So thank you. Everyone have a wonderful afternoon.
Same to you, Nicole.